Welcome to Whispering Willow Sleep, soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts and carry you toward peaceful sleep. Before we begin, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and, if you wish, what's on your mind. I read every note and love keeping quiet company across distances. If this brings you peace, a like and subscribe help me make more Nightbound stories. And if you'd like to support even further, you can buy me a coffee through the link in the description. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The fog arrived that morning as it always did in London, curling through Baker Street like a cat seeking warmth, pressing itself against window panes with the patience of something that knew it would eventually be let in. It was January of 1895, and the city wore its winter like a gentleman wore his evening clothes, with a certain weary elegance, as if both had seen better days, but refused to admit it. The gas lamps still burned low along the street, their glow softened to pale amber halos in the mist, and somewhere in the distance a costermonger's voice rose in a practised cry, selling chestnuts to those brave enough to face the cold before dawn had properly broken. Inside number 221B, the sitting room held its own peculiar warmth, the kind that came not just from the coal fire crackling steadily in the grate, but from the accumulated presence of two men who had made this space their own. The air carried layers of scent. Pipe tobacco, of course, the sweet Virginia blend that Holmes favoured mingling with the earthier notes of Watson's preferred shag. Beneath that, the faint metallic tang of chemical experiments recently concluded, though not recently enough to have been properly tidied away. The leather of the armchairs had absorbed years of quiet evenings, and breathed them back into the room. And there, resting in its case near the window where the morning light would soon find it, sat the violin. Watson noticed it first, as he often did these days, though he tried not to let his gaze linger too obviously. The case itself was battered, its black leather worn soft at the corners, the brass clasps tarnished to a dull gold that suggested they had been opened and closed countless times, always with the same hands, always with the same purpose. The violin within was a Stradivarius, or so Holmes claimed, though Watson had his private doubts about that particular assertion. Not that it mattered, really. What mattered was the way Holmes's entire bearing changed when he lifted it, the way his restless energy found focus in the bow's movement across strings, the way music seemed to be the only language in which the great detective allowed himself to speak of things he could not deduce. But the instrument had seen better days. Watson, who had shared these rooms for years now, who had observed with the careful eye of a medical man trained to notice the small failures of the body, could see that the violin was suffering its own small indignities. The varnish had worn thin in places, revealing the pale wood beneath like skin showing through a threadbare coat. One of the tuning pegs sat slightly loose, requiring adjustment before each performance. And the strings, well, the strings had been replaced so many times with whatever Holmes could obtain that they no longer matched, giving the instrument's voice an oddly mismatched quality, like a choir where each member sang in a different dialect. The morning light began its slow infiltration of the room, not so much breaking through the fog as gently suggesting its presence beneath it. Watson stood at the window, his hands clasped behind his back in an old military posture he could never quite abandon, watching the street below begin its daily transformation from sleeping to waking. A milk cart rattled past, its driver hunched against the cold, the horse's breath visible in great pluming clouds. A crossing sweeper, a boy no more than 10, emerged from some invisible corner and began his work with a broom nearly as tall as himself, clearing a path through the night's accumulated debris with the diligence of someone who knew that breakfast depended on thoroughness. Victorian London in the 1890s was a city of contrasts so sharp they could cut. A place where the gleam of the modern world pressed hard against the soot-stained remnants of an earlier age. The century was winding down like a pocket watch running out of spring, and everyone could feel it, that sense of something ending and something else, unknown, slightly troubling, waiting to begin. Electric lights had begun to appear on some streets, though Baker Street still relied on gas, and there was something almost defiant in the way those old lamps continued to burn, as if they refused to acknowledge that their time might be measured in years rather than decades. The British Empire stretched across the globe like a vast, ambitious stain on the map, and London was its heart, pumping wealth and ambition and occasionally conscience through arteries of commerce and rail. But hearts, as Watson well knew, could be complicated organs. They could pump steadily, while harbouring secret weaknesses. They could appear strong, while quietly failing. And London, for all its imperial grandeur, for all its museums and parks and monuments to progress, had its own hidden failures. The rookeries where the poor pressed together in darkness, the factories where children worked until their hands forgot what play felt like. The Thames that accepted the city's waste with the resignation of something that had long ago given up protesting. But here, in this sitting room, with the fire doing its gentle work and the day beginning its slow arrival, there was something like peace. Watson turned from the window and let his gaze travel across the familiar disorder of the room. The papers stacked on every surface, some of them case files, others newspapers, marked with Holmes' emphatic pencil, still others correspondence that might or might not ever receive replies. The shelves lined with books that ranged from the practical to the obscure, medical texts sitting beside treatises on obscure poisons, volumes of poetry shelved next to monographs on tobacco ash, the chemistry apparatus occupying one corner like a small, temperamental kingdom of glass and rubber tubing, the Persian slipper nailed to the mantelpiece, bulging with tobacco, because Holmes had decided, with the logic that governed all his domestic arrangements, that it was the most sensible place to store it, and the violin case, sitting in its spot by the window, waiting. Watson had been considering the problem for some weeks now, ever since an evening when Holmes had played particularly late into the night, one of those meandering improvisations that spoke of a mind working through something it could not quite articulate. Watson had lain in his room, listening through the floorboards, and had heard not just the music, but the small, sharp sound of a string breaking, followed by a pause, and then the music resuming, slightly altered, accommodating the loss. Holmes had said nothing about it the next morning, had simply continued, as if the violin were perfectly adequate to his needs. But Watson had heard that small, defeated sound, and had felt something twist in his chest. A recognition of the way men sometimes carried on with broken things, because acknowledging the breaking would require admitting to a vulnerability they preferred to keep hidden. The detective life, as Watson had come to understand it, was not the romantic adventure that his published accounts sometimes suggested. Oh, there were adventures, certainly, and romance of a sort. But there was also a great deal of waiting and watching and sitting in cold rooms at odd hours, hoping that someone would arrive who shouldn't. There was the tedium of false leads and the frustration of clever criminals who were just slightly cleverer than they needed to be. And there was Holmes himself, brilliant and impossible, capable of deductions that seemed like magic until he explained them, at which point they became merely obvious, the way all magic does when you learn the trick. But the violin was where Holmes went when the deductions failed, or when they succeeded too easily, or when the world proved slightly more stupid than even his low expectations had allowed for. It was his refuge and his consolation, and Watson, who understood about refugees, who had his own, the quiet routine of his practice, the methodical pleasure of writing, the comfort of a well-made cup of tea, wanted to do something about the poor state of that battered instrument. The problem, of course, was Holmes himself. The man noticed everything. He could deduce your morning's activities from the state of your collar, your financial troubles from the wear on your shoes, your recent travels from dust particles invisible to any normal eye. How did one surprise a man who treated surprise as a personal affront, a failure of observation that must be immediately analyzed and prevented from ever happening again? Mrs. Hudson, Watson thought. Mrs. Hudson would be the key. The housekeeper of 221B Baker Street was a woman who had elevated the art of managing difficult tenants to something approaching genius. She had endured chemical experiments that filled the building with noxious fumes, bullet holes in the walls fired in moments of boredom, irregular hours that made meal planning a form of optimistic fiction, and a stream of visitors ranging from the highest ranks of society to the lowest reaches of London's criminal underworld. She had done all this with a composure that suggested either infinite patience or a secret supply of very strong gin. Watson suspected both. More importantly, she had a soft spot for Holmes, though she would have denied it with the vigor of someone accused of an actual crime. Watson had seen it in the way she made sure there was always hot coffee when a case ran long into the night, in the way she never actually complained about the experiments, only threatened to, in the way she occasionally left small offerings of food outside the sitting-room door during periods when Holmes forgot that eating was a biological necessity rather than an optional activity. Yes, Mrs. Hudson would understand. Mrs. Hudson would help. And Mrs. Hudson, with her constant presence in the building, her coming and going with trays and linens, and the kind of domestic authority that made her effectively invisible to Holmes's notice, could provide the cover needed for the plan that was slowly forming in Watson's mind. The violin needed proper attention. Not just new strings or a tightened peg, but the kind of careful restoration that only a skilled craftsman could provide. London had such craftsmen, tucked away in workshops in Marylebone and Clerkenwell, men who understood the relationship between wood and sound, who could look at an instrument and see not just what it was, but what it had been, what it could be again with the right touch. Watson had made some inquiries, quietly, using the discretion he had learned from years of managing Holmes's affairs. He had found a man, a Mr. Abernathy, who specialized in exactly this kind of work, who had trained in Italy and returned to London with skills that were spoken of in reverent whispers among those who cared about such things. The cost would be substantial, but Watson had his pension, and his practice brought in enough, And more importantly, he had the conviction that some gestures mattered beyond their practical value. Holmes would never repair the violin himself. He would play it until it fell apart in his hands, and then he would find another instrument, probably equally battered, and would proceed to wear it out in turn. It was Watson's role, as he understood it, to notice these things, to care about them in the ways that Holmes either could not or would not. But first, they would need to remove the violin from its case without Holmes noticing. They would need to keep it away long enough for the repairs to be completed. And they would need to do all of this while Holmes was in residence, observing, deducing, being generally impossible in the way that had become so familiar it was almost comfortable. Watson smiled slightly at the challenge of it. There was something fitting about applying Holmes's own methods against him, about observation and deduction turned inward toward 221B itself. It would require planning, timing, and a bit of luck. It would require Mrs. Hudson's cooperation and discretion, but it could be done. It would be done. Outside, the fog continued its patient work, softening the edges of the city, making the familiar strange and the strange familiar. The gas lamps began to dim as daylight, such as it was, established itself. The sounds of morning grew more distinct, the rumble of cartwheels on cobblestones, the cry of newspaper boys, the general murmur of a great city waking to another day of its complicated existence. And in 221B Baker Street, in that sitting room where so many mysteries had been unravelled, a new one was about to begin. Small, domestic, and completely unintended, it would unfold over the coming days with the kind of gentle comedy that life sometimes provides when it decides to remind serious men that they are not quite as in control as they imagine. The violin sat in its case, waiting, unaware that it was about to become both the solution and the problem, the gift and the mystery. Watson looked at it one more time, then turned toward the door. It was time to find Mrs. Hudson and begin the conspiracy. The stairs creaked under his feet as he descended, each step producing that particular sound that old wood makes when it has learned to announce visitors. A sound so familiar it had become part of the building's voice. From below came the smell of breakfast being prepared, bacon and toast, and the particular bitterness of strong tea. Normal, domestic, peaceful. Watson reached the ground floor, paused, and then continued down to the kitchen, where he knew Mrs. Hudson would be at her morning work, and where a certain conversation was about to begin. The kitchen of 221B Baker Street existed in a state of perpetual negotiation between order and chaos, a reflection of the building itself, and the peculiar demands placed upon it by its upstairs tenants. It was a long, narrow room that stretched toward the back of the house, its walls lined with shelves that held an impressive array of crockery, some of it matching, most of it accumulated over years of practical necessity rather than aesthetic consideration. The range dominated one wall, its black iron surface gleaming from regular polishing, the fire within it breathing warmth into the space with a steady, comfortable presence that made the kitchen the warmest room in the building during these cold January days. Mrs. Hudson stood at the wooden table that occupied the center of the room, her hands working through the familiar motions of preparing breakfast, movements so practiced they required no conscious thought. She was a woman of middle years, though she would have been offended by any attempt to specify exactly which middle years those might be, with the kind of practical handsomeness that came from a life spent managing rather than being managed. Her grey hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her apron crisp despite the early hour, and her expression carried that particular quality of patient resignation that all landladies must cultivate if they wish to survive their profession with sanity intact. She looked up as Watson entered, her hands pausing in their work with the bread knife, and something in his expression, some combination of determination and uncertainty, made her set the knife down entirely and wipe her hands on her apron with the deliberate slowness of someone preparing for a conversation that might require her full attention. "Dr. Watson," she said, her voice carrying the warm edge of her Scottish origins, softened, but not erased by decades in London. "You're up early, or rather, you're down early. You've been standing at that window for the past 20 minutes, haven't you? I could hear the floorboards." Watson had the grace to look slightly sheepish. The building's tendency to announce movement through its ancient timbers was both a comfort and a betrayal, depending on one's purposes. "Mrs. Hudson," he began, then paused, suddenly uncertain how to proceed with what he had come to say. It was one thing to form a plan in the quiet of one's own mind, quite another to speak it aloud and invite another person into the conspiracy. "Sit down, Doctor," Mrs. Hudson said, not unkindly, gesturing toward one of the wooden chairs tucked under the table. "And I'll put the kettle on. Whatever you've come to discuss, it's clear you'll need tea for it, and so shall I." Watson sat, grateful for the excuse to delay his explanation, while Mrs. Hudson busied herself with the kettle, filling it from the tap, setting it on the range where it would take its time heating, as kettles always did when you were waiting for them. The kitchen smelled of toast and coal smoke, and the faint scent of washing soda, that particular combination of scents that marked it as a working space, a place where the practical business of keeping a household running was conducted with quiet efficiency. The building around them was beginning to wake in earnest now. Through the ceiling came the faint sounds of Holmes moving about in the sitting room above, his footsteps recognizable by their characteristic restless pace, the walk of a man whose mind moved faster than his feet could comfortably follow. Water ran in the pipes as he performed his morning ablutions, and Watson found himself listening to these sounds with the attention of someone planning a crime, cataloguing Holmes's routines, considering the windows of opportunity that might exist within the detective's day. Mrs. Hudson returned to the table with 2 cups, the tea not yet ready, but the ritual of preparation providing its own comfort. She sat across from Watson, folded her hands on the table in a gesture that managed to be both patient and expectant, and waited. She was good at waiting, having had years of practice with tenants who often needed time to arrive at their point. "It's about Mr. Holmes's violin," Watson said finally, the words coming out in a rush now that he'd committed to speaking them. "The instrument is... well, it's in rather poor condition, Mrs. Hudson. I've been noticing it for some time now. The varnish is worn, the strings are mismatched, and there's a looseness to one of the pegs that concerns me. It affects the sound, you see, though Holmes has never complained. But then, he wouldn't complain, would he? He'd simply make do, as he makes do with everything, until the thing falls apart entirely in his hands." Mrs. Hudson's expression had shifted during this speech, moving from curiosity to understanding, to something that looked almost like approval. "You want to have it repaired," she said, a statement rather than a question. "Properly repaired by someone who knows what they're doing. And you're worried that Mr. Holmes will notice if it disappears for the time required." "Exactly. Watson said, relieved to find his concerns understood so immediately. "I've found a craftsman, a Mr. Abernathy in Marylebone, who specializes in violin restoration. His reputation is excellent, and I've made preliminary inquiries. He could do the work in a matter of days, perhaps a week, if the damage is more extensive than I think. But the violin would need to be out of the flat during that time, and Holmes, well, Holmes notices everything." "He does," Mrs. Hudson agreed, her tone suggesting she had been on the receiving end of Holmes's observations more times than she cared to count. "He once told me I'd been visiting my sister in Camberwell, based on the mud on my boots and the particular way I'd arranged the tea things. The mud, apparently, was distinctive to her street. And I only fuss with the tea service when I'm worried, and I only worry after seeing her because she insists on discussing her husband's business failures." She paused, shaking her head at the memory. "The man is a menace to privacy." Watson found himself smiling, despite the seriousness of their discussion. "Precisely. So you see the challenge. We need to remove the violin, have it repaired, and return it without him noticing it's been gone. Or, if he notices it's gone, we need him to believe there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for its absence that has nothing to do with us." The kettle began to whistle, a soft sound at first that would build to something more insistent if ignored. Mrs. Hudson rose to attend to it, taking her time with the ritual of tea-making, warming the pot, measuring the leaves with the precision of someone who understood that good tea was not an accident, but an achievement. She poured the water, set the pot between them with 2 fresh cups, and resumed her seat, all while Watson waited with the particular tension of someone whose proposal hung in the balance. "It's a kind gesture, Doctor," Mrs. Hudson said finally, pouring tea for them both, the liquid falling into the cups with a sound like quiet conversation. "Mr. Holmes doesn't often inspire such gestures, being as he is, difficult. But he's fortunate to have a friend who notices these things, who cares about them." Watson felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the tea or the kitchen's fire. There was something deeply satisfying about having one's intentions understood and approved, particularly by someone as sensible as Mrs. Hudson. "The question," Mrs. Hudson continued, her tone becoming more businesslike, "is how to manage it. Mr. Holmes keeps odd hours, but he's almost always here, and when he's not here, he returns at unpredictable times. The violin sits in the sitting room where he can see it, though I don't think he actually looks at it most of the time. It's more that he knows it's there, the way you know where your own hand is without having to check." "I've been considering that," Watson said, leaning forward slightly, his voice dropping, though there was no one to overhear them. Above, Holmes's footsteps continued their restless pattern, and the building creaked its usual morning creaks. But the kitchen felt suddenly conspiratorial, a pocket of privacy within the larger space. "He has a case developing, something to do with a missing inheritance and a suspicious nephew. He mentioned yesterday that it would require some travel, possibly to Surrey, to interview witnesses and examine the property in question. When he's out on such excursions, he's often gone the entire day, sometimes longer if the trail proves interesting." Mrs. Hudson nodded slowly, her eyes taking on the calculating expression of someone planning a campaign. "And you're thinking that would be our opportunity. While he's in Surrey asking his questions and making his deductions, we remove the violin, take it to this Mr. Abernathy, and have him begin the work." "Exactly. But we'd need to be careful about the timing. If Holmes returns unexpectedly and finds the violin gone, he'll immediately know something is amiss. He might even deduce the entire plan from whatever small traces we leave behind. "Then we leave no traces," Mrs. Hudson said firmly. "Or rather, we leave the right traces. The case should remain where it sits, opened as if Mr. Holmes had simply taken the violin out to play and not yet returned it. A music stand left near the chair, perhaps, as if he'd been practicing. Some sheet music lying open, the bow resting on the arm of his chair. Small things that suggest the violin is simply in use elsewhere in the flat, not missing." Watson felt a surge of admiration for Mrs. Hudson's tactical thinking. She understood deception not as a grand theatrical gesture, but as a series of small, careful details that together formed a convincing picture. It was almost Holmesian in its approach, and there was a certain satisfaction in turning the detective's own methods back upon him. "When does this case take him to Surrey?" Mrs. Hudson asked, already moving forward in the plan as if its success were now inevitable. "He mentioned Thursday as a possibility, assuming the nephew agrees to an interview. That gives us 3 days to prepare, to make certain Mr. Abernathy is ready to receive the violin and begin work immediately. Time is our enemy here. The longer the violin is gone, the greater the chance Holmes will notice its absence, despite our precautions." Mrs. Hudson poured more tea, a gesture that had become almost meditative in the quiet of the kitchen. The morning light, filtered through fog, and the small window that looked out onto the narrow yard behind the building, cast everything in soft grey tones that made the space feel removed from time. A pocket of stillness before the day's demands fully asserted themselves. "I'll help you," she said simply. "It's a good thing you're doing, Doctor, even if Mr. Holmes might not initially see it that way. He's not comfortable with kindness, that one. He's learned to trust logic and evidence, but kindness confuses him, makes him suspicious. But that's his difficulty to manage, not ours." He might be annoyed, Watson admitted, thinking of Holmes's likely reaction to discovering he'd been the subject of a benevolent conspiracy. "He might," Mrs. Hudson agreed, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "But he'll also have a properly restored violin, and in time he'll come to appreciate that. Mr. Holmes is many things, Doctor, but he's not ungrateful. He simply expresses gratitude in odd ways, usually by not complaining, which, for him, is high praise indeed." They sat together in the kitchen's warmth, two conspirators united in purpose, and Watson felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness, of small rebellion against the world's tendency toward neglect and entropy. Holmes spent his life solving other people's mysteries, restoring order to chaos, finding what was lost. It seemed only fitting that someone should do the same for him, even if the something was only a battered violin that meant more than its physical value could ever suggest. Above them, Holmes's footsteps had stilled, which likely meant he'd settled into his chair with the morning papers, or perhaps with correspondence related to his cases. The building breathed around them, pipes ticking as hot water moved through them, floorboards settling, the small sounds of a structure that had stood for over a century and intended to stand for at least another. "Thursday, then," Mrs. Hudson said, her tone decisive. "I'll make sure there's a reason for me to be in the sitting room that morning, fresh linens for the sofa, perhaps, or some matter with the windows that requires attention. You'll need to engage Mr. Holmes in conversation if he's still present, keep his attention directed away from what I'm doing. And then when the moment is right, when he's looking at you and not at the violin case. You'll take it, Watson finished. Down the back stairs, where he's less likely to hear. Out through the rear entrance. I'll have a cab waiting in the alley, already paid for discretion. Mr. Abernathy will be expecting us. And the bow? Mrs. Hudson asked, already thinking through the details, with the thoroughness of someone who understood that details mattered. Mr. Holmes might notice if both the violin and bow disappeared together. The bow stays, Watson decided, left casually, as you suggested, as if he'd been playing recently, and the case remains open, visible, but empty. If he glances at it, he'll assume the violin is simply elsewhere in the flat, taken out for some purpose and not yet returned. Mrs. Hudson nodded, satisfied with this arrangement. And when the repair is complete, how do we return it without him noticing? That, Watson admitted, I haven't entirely worked out yet, but I suspect that will be the easier part. Once the violin is back in the building, we can find a moment to restore it to its case, perhaps when he's asleep, or deeply engaged in some experiment. The important thing is removing it initially without detection. They finished their tea in companionable silence, two people who had arrived at an understanding and needed no further words to confirm it. Outside, London continued its morning transformation, the fog beginning its slow retreat as the weak January sun asserted what authority it could. The sounds of the city grew more distinct. The clatter of horse-drawn traffic, the calls of street vendors, the general cacophony of a metropolis in motion. Watson rose from his chair, feeling lighter than he had when he'd descended to the kitchen. The plan had moved from possibility to intention, from his private consideration to shared conspiracy. "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson," he said simply. "I know this is asking quite a lot." "It's asking very little, Doctor," she replied, standing to clear the tea things, with movements that had become automatic over years of practice. "I've managed far stranger requests in this household. Compared to disposing of chemical waste or explaining bullet holes to the other tenants, smuggling a violin out for repair is practically mundane." Watson smiled at this assessment, recognizing the truth in it. Life at 221B Baker Street had never been conventional, and perhaps that was precisely what made it home. "Thursday morning, then. I'll confirm with Mr. Abernathy today that he's prepared to receive the instrument and begin work immediately." "Thursday morning," Mrs. Hudson confirmed. "And Doctor, Mr. Holmes is lucky to have you, even if he doesn't always. Remember to say so." Watson felt that warmth again, that sense of being understood and valued. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and turned toward the stairs that would carry him back up to the sitting room, where Holmes would be waiting, oblivious to the conspiracy forming around him, unaware that his battered violin had become the center of a small, gentle plot conducted entirely in the service of friendship. The stairs creaked their familiar greeting as he climbed, and Watson found himself already rehearsing the casual conversation he would need to maintain on Thursday morning, the performance of normalcy that would allow Mrs. Hudson to work her quiet magic. It would require skill, this deception. It would require attention to detail and careful timing. But then, Watson thought as he reached the landing, Holmes himself had taught him those skills, had shown him how to observe and deduce and plan. There was a certain poetry in applying those lessons to surprise the teacher. The sitting-room door stood slightly ajar, and through it Watson could hear the rustle of newspaper pages. He paused for just a moment, allowing himself to savour the anticipation of what was to come, and then pushed the door open and stepped back into the familiar chaos of their shared life. The game, as Holmes himself might say, was afoot. The days between conspiracy and execution have a peculiar quality, a weight that ordinary hours do not possess. Watson found himself moving through the routines of life at 220 Bod Baker Street with a heightened awareness, noticing details he had previously allowed to blur into the comfortable background of familiarity. The way Holmes drummed his fingers on the arm of his chair when thinking, a rhythm that seemed to correspond to some internal calculation invisible to everyone else. The angle at which the morning light fell across the Persian rug, creating patterns that shifted with the hours like a sundial, marking time in geometry rather than numbers. The particular creak of the third stair from the bottom, which announced visitors with such reliability that Holmes often knew who was coming based solely on their pattern of ascent. Wednesday arrived, wrapped in the kind of cold that made London feel like a city carved from iron, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs and turn breath into visible proof of life. The fog had lifted somewhat, replaced by a clarity that was almost harsh, revealing the soot-stained buildings and narrow streets with an honesty that the mist usually softened. From the sitting-room window, Watson could see chimney sweeps at their morning work, small dark figures against the pale sky, and the sight made him think, as it always did, about the peculiar cruelties of Victorian progress, how a society could split the atom of human potential into such vastly different outcomes, depending entirely on the accident of one's birth. Holmes had been absorbed in his case for 2 days now, the matter of the suspicious nephew and the missing inheritance that Watson had mentioned to Mrs. Hudson. The details, as Holmes had explained them over breakfast on Tuesday, involved a country estate in Surrey, a recently deceased patriarch whose will had gone mysteriously missing, and a nephew whose grief seemed less profound than his interest in the property's value. It was exactly the sort of case that Holmes relished, not because it was particularly complex, but because it required the kind of methodical investigation that allowed him to demonstrate the superiority of observation over assumption, evidence over emotion. The nephew claims to have been devoted to his uncle, Holmes had said, spreading marmalade on his toast with the same precision he applied to everything else. Yet he cannot name a single book from his uncle's library, despite allegedly visiting every week for the past year. The library, Watson, contained over 3,000 volumes, many of them rare first editions. A man who spent weekly evenings with his uncle in that library would inevitably remember something. A title, an author, a conversation about literature. But our devoted nephew remembers nothing except that the books were very old and dusty, which is exactly what someone would say if they had never actually seen them. Watson had listened with the appreciation of someone who had heard variations of this lecture many times, but never tired of the performance. There was something deeply satisfying about watching Holmes work through a problem, peeling away the layers of deception with the same care a surgeon might use to expose the hidden structures of the body. Both professions, Watson reflected, were fundamentally about revealing truth, one truth being anatomical, the other moral, but both requiring similar dedication to precision. Now, on Wednesday afternoon, Holmes sat in his chair surrounded by papers, maps of Surrey, correspondence from the family solicitor, newspaper clippings about the deceased patriarch, who had been something of a local character, known for his eccentricity and his habit of feeding the village's stray cats, a detail that Holmes had declared irrelevant but charming, which is the worst combination for an investigation because it tempts one toward sentiment. The violin case sat in its usual spot by the window, the instrument inside, waiting. Watson tried not to look at it too obviously, tried not to let his gaze linger in a way that might draw Holmes's attention to his attention. The afternoon light was fading early, as it did in January, and Mrs. Hudson appeared with tea and scones, setting the tray on the table between the chairs, with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to disturb papers that might be arranged according to some logic invisible to ordinary perception. She caught Watson's eye for just a moment, a glance that conveyed volumes. "Tomorrow," the glance said, "we proceed as planned." Watson gave the smallest nod in return, gesture so slight it might have been mistaken for simply settling more deeply into his chair. "Mrs. Hudson," Holmes said without looking up from the map he was studying, "you've been baking scones with currants, unless my nose deceives me, which it never does. This suggests either that you're expecting visitors of some importance, or that you're in an unusually good mood. Given that you're not wearing your good apron, I deduce the latter. Something has pleased you recently, something domestic rather than financial, because your hands show no signs of the ink that would indicate you'd been reviewing accounts. A letter from your sister, perhaps. Good news about her husband's prospects." Mrs. Hudson's expression flickered between annoyance and resignation, the look of someone who had grown accustomed to having her privacy cheerfully invaded. "My sister's husband has found employment. Yes, Mr. Holmes. Though how you deduce that from scones and aprons is beyond me." "You bake when you're happy," Holmes said simply, finally looking up from his papers. "And you're only happy about your sister's news when it's good, because bad news makes you clean compulsively instead. The sitting room hasn't been dusted today, therefore good news. The employment deduction is merely the most likely explanation for good news concerning a man who has been unemployed for 8 months. Sometimes," Mrs. Hudson said with the dignity of someone refusing to be entirely transparent, "a woman bakes simply because she has currants that need using." "Possible, but unlikely," Holmes replied, already returning his attention to the map. "Though I appreciate the effort toward mystery. It's refreshing." Watson hid his smile behind his teacup. This was the Holmes that the public rarely saw, the one who existed in the small moments between cases, who applied his abilities to trivial domestic observations, because his mind could not help but analyze everything it encountered. It was both impressive and slightly exhausting, like living with a piece of particularly sophisticated machinery that had no off switch. The evening settled around them with the comfortable weight of routine. Holmes continued his preparations for the next day's journey to Surrey, making notes in his peculiar shorthand, occasionally reading aloud passages from the solicitor's letters that struck him as particularly significant, or particularly stupid. He seemed to consider both qualities equally worthy of attention. Watson attended to his own correspondence, letters from former patients and colleagues, the small administrative details that accompanied his modest medical practice. The fire burned steadily in the grate, and outside, London transformed into its nighttime self, gas lamps creating pools of amber light along Baker Street, the fog returning, as it always did, when the sun abandoned its post. "I'll need to depart early tomorrow," Holmes announced around 8 o'clock, setting aside his papers with the air of someone who had completed his preparations and now required only execution. "The first train to Guildford leaves at 7:30, and I intend to be on it. The nephew has agreed to meet me at the estate at 10, which gives me time to examine the grounds before subjecting myself to his doubtlessly rehearsed expressions of grief and innocence." "Shall I accompany you?" Watson asked, the question automatic, despite knowing that tomorrow's excursion served multiple purposes, only one of which involved Surrey and suspicious nephews. Holmes considered this for a moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in the gesture that usually preceded pronouncement. "I think not, Watson. This initial interview will be largely observational, and two of us might make the nephew defensive. Better that I go alone, establish rapport, such as it is, and then perhaps you can join me on a subsequent visit if the case develops interestingly. These estate matters often require multiple excursions." Watson nodded, relief flooding through him, though he was careful not to let it show. This was precisely what they needed. Holmes gone for the entire day, occupied with interviews and investigations in Surrey, while Mrs. Hudson and Watson executed their own small investigation at 221B. The timing could not have been better, which made Watson briefly suspicious that the universe was conspiring in their favor, though he quickly dismissed this as sentiment rather than logic. The evening progressed in its usual fashion. Holmes played the violin for a while, one of his improvisations that started as something recognizable. Bach, Watson thought, or perhaps Vivaldi, and then wandered into original territory, the notes climbing and falling according to some internal logic that made perfect sense to the player and mysterious sense to the listener. Watson listened with half his attention while reading the evening paper, noting without conscious thought the places where the instrument's worn strings created slight dissonances, the way Holmes adjusted his playing to accommodate the loose tuning peg. Tomorrow, Watson thought. Tomorrow, the violin would begin its journey toward restoration, and Holmes would return to find it playing as it should, as it perhaps once had, before years of use and minimal maintenance had taken their toll. The thought filled Watson with a satisfaction that was almost physical, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or the tea. Holmes finished his playing and returned the violin to its case with the casual care of long practice, settling the instrument into its velvet-lined interior, placing the bow beside it, closing the lid but not fastening the clasps. He never fastened the clasps, Watson had noticed, as if keeping the violin locked away seemed too much like imprisonment. The case remained open, inviting, ready for the next time Holmes felt the need to translate thought into sound. "You're looking thoughtful, Watson," Holmes observed, settling back into his chair and reaching for his pipe, another evening ritual beginning. "Something on your mind beyond the usual concerns about my habits and your practice?" Watson started slightly, caught in his own contemplation. "Nothing significant," he said, which was both true and false in the way that many statements about internal states tend to be. "Simply thinking about time, I suppose, how it passes, what it does to things. The violin sounds different than it did when I first came to Baker Street. Older, somehow. Tired." Holmes lit his pipe with a match that flared briefly in the darkening room, the flame casting dramatic shadows across his sharp features before settling into the steady glow of burning tobacco. Everything ages, Watson. Violins, buildings, people. The question is whether they age into something better or merely into something diminished. Violins, properly maintained, can improve with age. The wood settles, the sound matures. But neglect. He paused, drawing on the pipe. Neglect is always corrosive. It's the small failures of attention that accumulate into larger failures of function. Watson felt a flush of vindication at these words, though he kept his expression neutral. Holmes had just articulated precisely the philosophy that had driven Watson's conspiracy, even if the detective remained unaware of his own role in justifying it. Sometimes, Watson thought, people needed rescuing from their own neglect, particularly when they were too occupied with rescuing everyone else to notice their own small emergencies. The night deepened around them. Holmes eventually abandoned his pipe for a book, some dense treatise on medieval land law that he claimed was relevant to the Surrey case, though Watson suspected he simply enjoyed reading about obscure legal precedents, the way some men enjoyed adventure novels. Watson made a show of reading as well, though his mind kept drifting to tomorrow, to the carefully orchestrated sequence of events that would need to unfold with precision if their plan was to succeed. Mrs. Hudson appeared briefly around 10 to collect the tea things and bank the fire for the night, her movements efficient and familiar. She avoided looking directly at Watson, which was itself a form of communication, an acknowledgement of their shared purpose, a confirmation that nothing had changed, that tomorrow would proceed as discussed. Holmes thanked her absently, already absorbed in his book, and she departed with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. Eventually, the evening wound down in the way evenings at 221B always did, with Holmes declaring his intention to retire, though Watson suspected he would actually remain awake for several more hours, reading or thinking, or perhaps playing the violin very quietly, so as not to disturb the building's other occupants. Watson excused himself to his own room, where he lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the house settling for the night, the creaks and sighs of old wood, the distant rumble of late traffic on Baker Street. Tomorrow would be the day. Tomorrow the conspiracy would move from planning to action. Tomorrow Holmes would depart for Surrey in search of truth about a missing will, while Watson and Mrs. Hudson would remain behind to address a different kind of missing, a different kind of truth. The truth that friendship sometimes required gentle deception in service of care. Watson lay awake longer than usual, his mind rehearsing the sequence of events, identifying potential complications, planning contingencies. The doctor in him recognized this as a form of pre-operative preparation, the mental checklist that preceded any significant intervention. The friend in him simply wanted to do right by Holmes, to offer a gesture that might never be acknowledged, but that would nonetheless have meaning. Outside, London breathed its nighttime breath, the city never truly sleeping, but merely shifting into a different mode of existence. Somewhere out there, criminals were plotting their crimes, victims were walking unknowingly toward misfortune, and Holmes's cases were waiting like equations waiting to be solved. But here, in 221B Baker Street, in this sitting room where so many mysteries had been unravelled, a different kind of mystery was about to begin. Watson finally drifted towards sleep, his last conscious thought a strange mixture of anticipation and contentment. Tomorrow would test their planning, their timing, their ability to deceive someone who made his living seeing through deceptions. But it would also, if successful, restore something that had been slowly failing, would return an instrument to its proper voice. The violin sat in its case in the darkened sitting room, waiting, unaware that its tomorrow would be different from all its yesterdays, that it was about to embark on a journey toward renewal. Carried by conspiring hands through foggy London streets to a craftsman who would see it not as it was, but as it could be again. And in Surrey, a suspicious nephew waited for his interview with the famous detective, equally unaware that his carefully constructed story would soon be dismantled by observation and logic, that truth had a way of revealing itself when Holmes turned his attention toward it. Two mysteries, Watson thought, as sleep finally claimed him. One in Surrey, one here at home. And by tomorrow evening both would be in motion, unfolding according to plans made by careful minds working toward resolution. The night pressed against the windows, and Baker Street dreamed its Victorian dreams. Thursday morning arrived with the particular quality of light that London produced in late January, a thin, watery luminescence that suggested the sun had woken reluctantly, and with considerable doubt about the value of the entire enterprise. The fog had returned during the night, not the thick, dramatic fog that swallowed streets whole and turned the city into something from a Gothic novel, but rather a persistent mist that clung to surfaces and made everything slightly damp, slightly uncertain, as if the boundary between solid and vapour had become a matter of negotiation rather than fact. Watson woke earlier than usual, his body responding to the day's significance, before his mind had fully catalogued the reasons why. He lay for a moment in the grey light filtering through his bedroom curtains, listening to the sounds of the building coming to life around him. The pipes clanked as water moved through them, a sound like distant conversation in a language of percussion and flow. Below, he could hear Mrs. Hudson moving about in the kitchen, the familiar rhythm of breakfast preparation, the clatter of pans, the opening and closing of the range door, the small domestic symphony that marked the beginning of every day at 291B Baker Street. And from the sitting room, the unmistakable sounds of Holmes preparing for his journey to Surrey. Watson could track the detective's movements through the ceiling as clearly as if he could see through the floorboards, the opening of wardrobe doors, the rustle of clothing being selected and rejected, the footsteps moving from bedroom to sitting room and back again, as Holmes gathered whatever materials he deemed necessary for a day of investigation in the countryside. There was a briskness to the sounds, an efficiency that spoke of a mind already engaged with the day's primary puzzle, the suspicious nephew and his convenient amnesia about his uncle's library. Watson dressed with care, choosing clothes appropriate for his own day's deception. Comfortable, but respectable, the kind of attire that suggested a doctor at leisure, rather than a doctor engaged in conspiracy. He checked his pocket watch, a gift from his late father that had survived both medical school and military service, and noted that it was just past 6:30. Holmes would be leaving within the hour, which meant the final phase of their planning was about to begin. The sitting room, when Watson entered it, showed the evidence of Holmes' morning preparations. Papers had been gathered and organized into folders. A travelling case sat by the door already packed and fastened, and Holmes himself stood at the window, fully dressed in his travelling clothes, the long overcoat, the scarf, the hat that he wore at a particular angle that somehow managed to be both conventional and distinctive. He was drinking coffee from one of the cups that Mrs. Hudson had brought up earlier, his attention directed toward the street below, where the morning's traffic was beginning its slow accumulation. "Ah, Watson," Holmes said, without turning from the window. "You're awake early. I trust my preparations haven't disturbed your rest." "Not at all," Watson replied, moving toward the breakfast table, where Mrs. Hudson had laid out their morning meal, toast and eggs and bacon, the kind of substantial breakfast that acknowledged January's cold and the day's demands. "I'm simply an early riser by habit. Military training, you know. The army teaches you that dawn is not a suggestion, but a command." Holmes turned from the window, and Watson found himself subjected to one of those rapid, comprehensive examinations that the detective performed so casually, reading Watson the way other men might read a newspaper. "You slept poorly, though," Holmes observed. "The slight darkness under your eyes suggests restless sleep, and you've nicked yourself shaving on the left side of your jaw, which only happens when you're distracted. Something on your mind, my dear fellow." Watson touched his jaw reflexively, feeling the small cut he hadn't noticed in his own mirror. Of course Holmes would notice. Holmes noticed everything, which made their planned deception either utterly foolish or magnificently bold, depending on one's perspective. "Nothing significant," Watson said, which was becoming his default response to Holmes's observations. Perhaps simply the awareness that January is proving particularly dreary this year. The lack of sunlight affects one's sleep patterns. Holmes accepted this explanation with a small nod, already moving on to other concerns. He consulted his own pocket watch, a magnificent piece of Swiss engineering that he claimed to have won in a bet with a watchmaker who had attempted to pass off a forgery as genuine, though Watson suspected the real story was more complicated and less flattering to Holmes's gambling habits. "I should depart within 20 minutes, Holmes announced. "The nephew expects me at 10, but I want to arrive at the estate early, examine the grounds, speak with the servants if possible. The staff always know more than the family realizes, and they're often more honest, having less to lose by telling the truth." "Sound strategy," Watson agreed, helping himself to toast and trying to appear casual. Trying to eat at a normal pace, despite the fact that his stomach felt slightly tense with anticipation. Mrs. Hudson would be waiting for her cue, listening from below for the sounds that would indicate Holmes' departure. The plan required precision of timing, required Watson to engage Holmes in conversation at exactly the right moment, so that Mrs. Hudson could enter the sitting room without her presence seeming unusual or suspicious. Holmes moved about the room, making his final preparations, checking that he had his notebook, his pencil, the various small tools of investigation that he carried, like a doctor, might carry medical instruments. He paused at one point by the violin case, his hand resting briefly on its battered surface, and Watson felt his heart accelerate slightly, wondering if Holmes was about to open it, about to take the instrument with him for some inexplicable reason that would derail their entire carefully constructed plan. But Holmes simply stood there for a moment, his fingers drumming lightly on the case's lid, and then moved away toward his traveling bag. Watson released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The violin remained where it was, waiting, unaware that its own journey was about to begin. "The case sounds promising," Watson said, steering the conversation toward safer territory, toward the kind of discussion that might occupy Holmes's attention during these final minutes before departure. The nephew's inability to recall details about the library is certainly suspicious. What other evidence have you gathered? Holmes' face brightened in the way it always did when discussing a case, that particular animation that came from intellectual engagement. Several interesting points, he said, settling into his chair for just a moment, clearly unable to resist the opportunity to explain his reasoning. The nephew claims to have visited weekly, yet none of the servants remember his carriage or his arrival. He claims to have taken tea with his uncle. Yet the housekeeper insists that the uncle always took tea alone in his study and disliked company during that particular ritual. He claims to have been concerned about his uncle's failing health. Yet the local doctor reports that the uncle was in excellent condition for his age and expected to live for years. A fabricated relationship, then, Watson suggested, playing his role as the attentive audience that Holmes required, the sounding board against which ideas could be tested and refined. Indeed, the question is why? What does the nephew gain by inventing these visits? The obvious answer is legitimacy. By claiming a close relationship with his uncle, he establishes himself as the natural inheritor, the devoted family member who deserves the estate. But the will has vanished, you see, which creates a legal complication. Without the will, the estate defaults to the nearest male relative, which happens to be our nephew. Convenient, wouldn't you say? Extremely convenient, Watson agreed. So your theory is that the nephew somehow acquired and destroyed the will because it left the estate to someone else? Or to some cause the nephew found objectionable. The uncle was known for his eccentric sympathies, animal welfare, education for the poor, that sort of thing. It's entirely possible that the will bequeathed the estate to some charitable foundation, leaving the nephew with nothing despite his proximity to the bloodline. Better to destroy the will and inherit by default than to honor his uncle's actual wishes. Watson shook his head, genuinely disturbed by the casual cruelty of such an action. To deprive charities of a legacy simply to enrich oneself. It's remarkably cold-blooded. Most crime is, Holmes said matter-of-factly. Criminals tend to lack imagination about anyone's suffering except their own. They can conceive of their own disappointment at not inheriting, but they cannot conceive of the orphans who won't receive education, or the animals who won't receive care. It's a failure of empathy, which is also a failure of imagination. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed the quarter hour, 6:45. Holmes stood abruptly. The conversation concluded, his mind already moving toward the day ahead. "I should go," he announced. "The train won't wait, and I dislike rushing. Watson, I may not return until late this evening, depending on how the interview develops. Don't wait dinner for me." This was the moment. Watson stood as well, moving toward Holmes, with the kind of casual deliberation that he hoped appeared natural. "Before you go," he said, "I wanted to ask your opinion about a patient case I saw yesterday. A gentleman with symptoms that seemed to suggest angina, but with certain unusual features that made me doubt the diagnosis." Holmes paused, his hand on his travelling bag, torn between his schedule and his inability to resist a puzzle. "Unusual features?" he asked, his curiosity engaged, despite the ticking clock. Watson launched into a detailed description of a fictional patient, elaborating on symptoms he was inventing as he spoke. making the case just interesting enough to hold Holmes's attention while keeping his peripheral vision fixed on the doorway, waiting for Mrs. Hudson to appear. He spoke about chest pains and shortness of breath, about pulse rates and patient history, constructing a medical mystery that paralleled Holmes's own investigative methods. And then, exactly as planned, Mrs. Hudson appeared in the doorway carrying fresh linens. "Pardon the interruption, gentlemen," she said with the perfect neutrality of someone whose presence was so familiar as to be barely noticed. "I just need to replace the sofa cushions. The old ones have gone quite flat, and I found these in storage. I'll only be a moment." Holmes waved vaguely in acknowledgement, his attention still on Watson's medical puzzle. "The unusual features you mentioned," he said. "They suggest what alternative diagnosis?" Watson continued his explanation, aware of Mrs. Hudson moving about the room behind Holmes, aware of her approaching the violin case with movements that appeared casual, purposeful, completely ordinary. She straightened cushions on the sofa, adjusted the throw blanket, and in the process positioned herself next to the window where the violin waited in its open case. "Fascinating," Holmes was saying. "The symptoms could also indicate a digestive complaint, masquerading as cardiac distress. The vagus nerve, you see, can produce referred pain that mimics angina. Did you examine the patient's abdomen?" "I did," Watson said, watching Mrs. Hudson from the corner of his eye as she leaned down, as her hands moved with practiced efficiency to lift the violin from its case, to tuck it under the linens she carried, to conceal it within the folds of fabric with movements so smooth they seemed choreographed. The abdomen appeared normal, though there was some tenderness in the upper quadrant. "There, you see," Holmes said with satisfaction, "almost certainly a digestive issue, rather than cardiac. I would recommend—" He paused suddenly, his head tilting slightly, and Watson felt his heart stop. Had Holmes noticed? Had some small sound, some subtle change in the room's atmosphere alerted him to what was happening? But no. Holmes simply glanced at his watch again and grimaced slightly. "I would recommend further examination of the digestive system, but I really must go now, Watson, or I'll miss the train entirely. We can discuss your patient this evening when I return." Mrs. Hudson had already moved toward the door, the violin hidden in her bundle of linens, her pace unhurried, her expression showing nothing but the mild concentration of someone managing household tasks. She passed through the doorway and disappeared, and Watson forced himself to maintain his focus on Holmes, to show nothing of the relief flooding through him. "Of course," Watson said. "Safe travels, Holmes. I hope the interview proves productive." Holmes gathered his travelling bag and his folders, performed one final check of his pockets. Notebook, pencil, magnifying glass, all present and accounted for, and strode toward the door with the brisk energy of someone engaged in purposeful activity. At the threshold, he paused and turned back, his gaze sweeping across the sitting room in one of those comprehensive glances that seemed to catalogue everything. Watson held his breath, certain that this was the moment when Holmes would notice the violin's absence, would observe the empty case, would deduce the entire conspiracy from whatever small details Watson and Mrs. Hudson had failed to consider. But Holmes merely nodded, satisfied with whatever his inspection had revealed. "Until this evening, then," he said, and departed, his footsteps rapid on the stairs, descending toward the street and the waiting cab and the journey to Surrey. Watson stood frozen in the sitting room, listening to the sounds of Holmes' departure, The front door opening and closing, the cab driver's greeting, the clatter of wheels on cobblestones growing fainter as the vehicle pulled away. Only when silence had fully settled did Watson allow himself to move, to cross the room to the window and look down at Baker Street, now empty of Holmes and his purposes. They had done it. The first phase of the plan had succeeded. The violin was out of the room, out of the building, on its way to Mr. Abernathy's workshop in Marylebone, where it would receive the care and attention it had needed for so long. Watson turned back to examine the sitting room, seeing it now with Holmes's eyes, checking for any detail that might betray what had occurred. The violin case remained where it always sat, open, the bow resting on the arm of Holmes's chair, as Mrs. Hudson had suggested, placed there during her cushion rearranging to suggest recent use. The music stand stood nearby, with a sheet of music still open, a Beethoven sonata that Holmes had been working through earlier in the week. Everything appeared normal, domestic, undisturbed. The scene of a sitting room where a violin had been taken out for practice and simply not yet returned to its case. Satisfied, Watson descended the stairs to find Mrs. Hudson waiting in the hallway, the bundle of linens now conspicuously absent. "It's done," she said quietly, her voice carrying equal parts relief and triumph. "The cab is waiting in the alley, just as you arranged. I'll take it to Mr. Abernathy's now, and he's promised to begin work immediately." "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson," Watson said, meaning it, with an intensity that went beyond the words. "I couldn't have managed this without you." "Nonsense," she replied, but her expression softened. "It's a good thing you're doing, Doctor. Now go about your day as you normally would. The less we act as if anything unusual has happened, the better." She departed through the rear of the building, leaving Watson alone in the hallway, alone with the knowledge of what they had done and what it meant. The conspiracy had moved from planning to execution, and now they could only wait. Wait for the violin to be restored. Wait for Holmes to return from Surrey. Wait to see if their careful deception would hold, or if Holmes's legendary powers of observation would unravel everything they had attempted. Watson returned to the sitting room and settled into his chair, picking up the morning paper, though his mind was far from the headlines it contained. Outside, London continued its business, unaware that in one unremarkable building on Baker Street, a small drama of friendship and deception had just unfolded, a gentle conspiracy conducted entirely in the service of care. The violin case sat open by the window, empty now, waiting for an instrument that was already miles away, already in the hands of a craftsman who would see its potential beneath its wear, who would restore what time and use had diminished. And in Surrey, Holmes was arriving at an estate, preparing to unravel a nephew's deception, unaware that he himself was the subject of a deception far closer to home, one conducted not with malice, but with affection, not to harm, but to help. Two mysteries now in motion, Watson thought, and by evening at least one of them would be moving toward resolution. The hours after Holmes's departure possessed a strange elasticity, stretching and contracting according to Watson's fluctuating anxiety, rather than the steady progression measured by the mantelpiece clock. He attempted to occupy himself with the usual activities that filled his days when Holmes was away on cases. Correspondence with former colleagues, medical journals that had accumulated unread on his desk, the small administrative tasks that his practice required, even when conducted at the modest scale he maintained. But his attention kept drifting. returning again and again to the empty violin case by the window, to the bow resting on Holmes' chair arm, to the music stand with its open Beethoven sonata. All of these small theatrical props arranged to suggest normalcy while concealing absence. Around mid-morning, Watson descended to consult with Mrs. Hudson, finding her in the kitchen kneading bread dough with the kind of focused energy that suggested she too was managing her own nervous anticipation through physical activity. The kitchen smelled of yeast and flour, warm and fundamentally comforting, a scent that belonged to kitchens across centuries and continents, connecting this moment to countless others where bread had been made and life had continued its necessary routines. "Mr. Abernathy has the violin," Mrs. Hudson reported, without Watson needing to ask, her hands continuing their rhythmic work with the dough. "I delivered it myself not 2 hours ago. His workshop is exactly as you described. A small, cluttered place filled with instruments in various states of repair, smelling of wood and varnish and something else I couldn't quite identify. Rosin, perhaps, or some specialized oil. He examined the violin immediately, right there while I waited, turning it over in his hands like a doctor examining a patient." Watson found himself leaning forward, hungry for details. And what was his assessment? Mrs. Hudson paused in her kneading, her expression thoughtful. "He was gentle with it, Doctor. That's what struck me most. The way he handled it. You could see he understood what it meant. That it wasn't just wood and strings, but something that had been loved and used and depended upon. He pointed out the worn varnish, the loose peg, the mismatched strings, all the things you'd mentioned. But he also said," she paused, seeming to search for the exact words. "He said the instrument had good bones. That's how he put it. That beneath the wear, it was still fundamentally sound. That with proper restoration, it would sing beautifully again." Watson felt an unexpected tightness in his throat at this description. There was something deeply moving about the image of the craftsman examining Holmes' battered violin and seeing not just damage, but potential. Not just wear, but worthiness. "How long did he say the work would require?" 4 days, possibly 5, Mrs. Hudson replied, resuming her kneading with renewed purpose. "He wants to do it properly, you see, not rush it. He'll need to strip the old varnish in places and reapply it, replace all the strings with matched sets, repair the tuning peg, adjust the bridge, and something about the soundpost that I didn't entirely understand, but that he assured me was essential. He said—" She smiled slightly at the memory. "He said that Mr. Holmes has been playing an instrument that was limping when it should be dancing, and that he intended to restore its proper gait." Watson found himself smiling in return, grateful for Mr. Abernathy's evident passion for his craft, for the care he was prepared to lavish on an instrument that many might have dismissed as beyond worthwhile restoration. 4 or 5 days, he repeated, calculating. Holmes mentioned this Surrey case might require multiple visits, might develop into something requiring sustained attention. With any luck, the violin will be restored and returned before Holmes even notices its absence. "With any luck," Mrs. Hudson echoed, though her tone suggested she shared Watson's uncertainty about luck's reliability when dealing with Sherlock Holmes. The afternoon progressed with the measured pace that January afternoons in London always seemed to possess, the light never quite committing to brightness, the cold never quite achieving the drama of genuine severity. Watson attempted to read, to write, to do anything that might occupy his mind sufficiently to prevent constant speculation about what was happening in Surrey and what would happen when Holmes returned. The sitting room felt oddly empty despite his presence in it, as if Holmes's absence had created a vacuum that could not be filled by a single person, no matter how deliberately they occupied the space. Around 3 o'clock, Watson found himself standing at the window, looking down at Baker Street with its steady flow of traffic and pedestrians, and his gaze fell upon the violin case. Really looked at it, perhaps for the first time that day, despite having been aware of it constantly. The case sat open as Mrs. Hudson had arranged it, the velvet interior visible, the depression where the violin should rest now empty, a perfect outline of absence. The bow on the chair arm, the music stand with its opened score. All these elements arranged to suggest that the violin was simply elsewhere in the flat, temporarily displaced by recent use. But was the arrangement convincing? Would it hold up under Holmes' scrutiny? Watson tried to see the scene as Holmes would see it, tried to apply the detective's methods to their own deception. What would Holmes notice? What small detail might betray the truth? The more Watson considered it, the more his confidence began to erode. The bow's placement, for instance. Was it exactly where Holmes would have left it after playing? Or was it positioned slightly differently, in a way that Holmes's muscle memory would immediately recognize as wrong? The music on the stand. Had Holmes actually been practicing that particular Beethoven sonata recently? Or had they chosen a piece he'd already moved past, creating an anachronism that would be immediately apparent to someone who tracked such details? And the case itself. Holmes never fastened the clasps. Watson had observed that. But did he leave it open at precisely this angle? Did the lid rest at exactly this degree of openness? Or was there some slight variation that would trigger Holmes's notice the moment he entered the room? Watson felt anxiety rising in his chest, like floodwater, threatening to overwhelm the calm competence with which he'd approached the entire conspiracy. Perhaps they had been foolish to attempt this. Perhaps they had underestimated Holmes' powers of observation, had allowed their familiarity with the detective to breed a dangerous assumption that they understood how his mind worked. Holmes made his living seeing what others missed. How had Watson convinced himself that he could hide something in plain sight from a man who made hiding things impossible? He needed air. He needed distance from the sitting room and its accusatory emptiness. Watson grabbed his coat and hat, descended the stairs with more haste than dignity, and emerged onto Baker Street, where the January afternoon greeted him with cold clarity. London in winter possessed its own peculiar beauty, Watson reflected as he walked without particular direction, his feet choosing turnings according to some internal compass that required no conscious guidance. The leafless trees in the small parks created delicate sketches against the pale sky, their branches forming geometric patterns that seemed almost mathematical in their precision. The buildings stood with the sombre dignity of structures that had weathered decades, that would weather decades more, their brick facades darkened by soot and time, but fundamentally enduring. The people he passed moved with purpose, wrapped in their own concerns, each one the protagonist of their own internal narrative, their own small dramas and conspiracies. He found himself thinking about Holmes, about their years of friendship, about how that friendship had developed in ways neither of them had quite articulated, but both understood. They were not demonstrative men, he and Holmes. They did not speak of affection or attachment in the direct way that perhaps more modern, more emotionally forthcoming people might. Instead, they showed care through actions, Watson by managing Holmes's affairs, by ensuring he ate during cases, by being present during the dangerous moments when backup might be needed. Holmes by trusting Watson with his cases, by including him in investigations, by that particular quality of attention he offered when Watson spoke, as if Watson's observations mattered, as if his presence had value beyond mere convenience. The violin repair was simply another action in that vocabulary of unspoken affection. Watson was attempting to care for something Holmes cared about, even if Holmes would never have cared for it himself, even if the detective would have continued playing the instrument until it literally fell apart in his hands. It was a gesture of friendship, conducted in the language that men of their generation and class understood, practical assistance offered without fuss, without expectation of gratitude, simply because it needed doing, and one was positioned to do it. But now, walking through London's afternoon streets, Watson wondered if he had overreached, if his gesture had been not friendship, but presumption, an unwelcome intrusion into Holmes's affairs disguised as help. What if Holmes didn't want the violin repaired? What if the wear and damage were part of its value for him, marks of use that carried their own meaning? What if Watson had taken something that wasn't his to take and changed it in ways that couldn't be unchanged? He turned into a small park, one of those pocket green spaces that London scattered throughout its density, like small breathing holes in the city's fabric. A few people sat on benches, despite the cold. A nanny with a child, an elderly gentleman feeding pigeons, with the solemnity of someone performing an important ritual. A young couple speaking in low, earnest voices about matters that seemed of tremendous importance to them and no one else. Watson found an empty bench and sat, letting the cold seep through his coat, using its discomfort to anchor himself against the rising tide of second-guessing. What was done was done. The violin was already in Mr. Abernathy's hands, already undergoing whatever processes the craftsman deemed necessary for restoration. There was no retrieving it now, no undoing the conspiracy, no stopping the sequence of events they had set in motion. All Watson could do was wait. Wait for the violin's restoration to be completed. Wait for Holmes to return from Surrey. Wait to see if their deception held or collapsed under the weight of Holmes's observation. The afternoon light was already beginning its fade toward evening, that early darkness that January imposed, regardless of human preferences about when day should end. Watson stood from the bench, his body stiff from cold and stillness, and began the walk back to Baker Street. Whatever anxiety he felt, whatever doubts plagued him, he needed to return to 220 Warby, needed to be present when Holmes came home from Surrey, needed to maintain the appearance of normalcy, even if normalcy felt increasingly like a performance he wasn't certain he could sustain. He arrived back at the building as the lamplighters were beginning their evening work, touching flame to gas and creating those pools of warm light that would burn through the coming darkness. Mrs. Hudson met him in the hallway, her expression immediately concerned. "Dr. Watson, you look frozen through. Come down to the kitchen and I'll make you tea. Has something happened?" "Nothing's happened," Watson assured her, though he was grateful for the offer of tea and warmth. "I simply needed to walk, to think." But I've returned, and now we wait." They sat together in the kitchen, drinking tea that Mrs. Hudson had made strong and sweet, the kind of tea that was less beverage than medicine, meant to fortify and comfort. The kitchen window showed darkness now. The day surrendered to night, and somewhere out there Holmes was concluding his interviews in Surrey, was gathering his evidence, was preparing to return to London and to Baker Street, and to the sitting room where an empty violin case waited to test whether friendship's deceptions could survive the scrutiny of the world's greatest detective. "He'll be pleased," Mrs. Hudson said, quietly, as if she could read Watson's spiral of doubt in his silence. "When it's all done and the violin is restored, when he plays it and hears how it sounds as it should sound, he'll be pleased, Doctor. He may not say so, because Mr. Holmes isn't much for saying things outright, but he'll feel it. And that's what matters, isn't it? Not the words, but the feeling beneath them." Watson nodded, wanting to believe her, choosing to believe her because the alternative was to continue doubting a decision that couldn't be undone. "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson, for everything, your help, your discretion, and now your reassurance. I couldn't have managed any of this without you." "We're conspirators now," she said with a slight smile, "partners in benevolent crime. Though I must say, Doctor, if this is what conspiracy feels like, all this worry and second-guessing, I don't know how actual criminals manage it. My nerves are quite worn, and we've only been at it for one day." Watson found himself laughing despite everything, grateful for her ability to find humour in their situation. "Indeed, perhaps we should stick to honest living after this. Leave deception to those with sturdier constitutions." They finished their tea in companionable silence, two people who had taken a risk together, and now could only wait to discover if the risk had been worthwhile. Eventually, Watson excused himself and returned upstairs to the sitting room, where he settled into his chair with a book he had no real intention of reading, simply holding it as a prop for normalcy, while his attention remained fixed on the sound of the street below, listening for the particular clatter of a cab arriving, for the sound of Holmes' footsteps on the stairs, for the moment when their conspiracy would face its first real test. The evening deepened around 221B Baker Street. The fire burned steadily in the grate, the gas lamps cast their gentle glow, and the empty violin case sat by the window, waiting, a small absence at the centre of a room full of presences, a silence that would soon need to be explained or overlooked or somehow justified. And Watson waited, trying to read, trying to remain calm, trying to trust that friendship knew better than anxiety, that care justified risk, that some gestures mattered even when, especially when, they required deception to accomplish. London breathed its nighttime breath outside the windows, and somewhere in that vast darkness, Holmes was returning, carrying his Surrey conclusions, unaware that he was also returning to a mystery much closer to home, one that Watson had created, and now had no choice but to see through to whatever resolution awaited them. The clock ticked, the fire crackled, the empty case waited, and Watson, sitting in the warm lamplight of 221B Baker Street, prepared himself for Holmes's return and for whatever that return would bring. The sound of a cab pulling up outside 221B Baker Street, shortly after 9 o'clock that evening, produced in Watson a physiological response he recognized from his military days. The particular acceleration of heartbeat that preceded engagement, the slight tightening of muscles preparing for action, the heightened alertness that transformed ordinary perception into something more acute, more focused. He had been sitting in his chair for the past hour, the book in his lap, serving no purpose except to give his hands something to hold, his eyes tracking the same paragraph repeatedly without absorbing its meaning, his attention devoted entirely to listening for the sounds that would announce Holmes's return. And now those sounds arrived, the cab door opening and closing, the brief exchange between Holmes and the driver, coins changing hands with the small metallic music they made, footsteps on the pavement, the front door of the building opening, admitting both Holmes and a gust of cold night air that Watson could feel even from the sitting room above. Then the stairs, those familiar creaking stairs announcing Holmes's ascent with their wooden vocabulary of sound. Watson set his book aside with deliberate casualness, arranging his expression into something he hoped resembled ordinary interest rather than barely suppressed anxiety. The door opened, and Holmes entered, bringing with him the scent of the outside world. Coal smoke and fog, and the particular smell of train stations, that combination of steam and oil and humanity that marked Britain's great temples of locomotive transit. Holmes looked tired. Watson noted with the physician's eye that never quite stopped assessing. There were shadows under the detective's eyes that suggested the day had been long and demanding, and his movements as he removed his coat and hat carried a heaviness that spoke of mental exhaustion rather than physical fatigue. The mind, Watson knew from observing Holmes over the years, could tire as thoroughly as any muscle, perhaps more so, because it had no equivalent of the body's involuntary systems to keep it functioning when conscious will faltered. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice carrying that particular quality of relief that came from returning to familiar surroundings after extended absence. "Still awake, I see. Waiting up for me, or simply unable to sleep?" "A bit of both," Watson replied, which had the advantage of being true. "I confess I was curious about your day in Surrey. How did the interview with the nephew proceed?" Holmes moved toward his chair, that same chair he had occupied for years, that had moulded itself to his particular posture and habits, the way long relationships moulded people to each other's shapes. He sank into it with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep within, a release of tension that had been held throughout the day. His gaze swept across the sitting room in that characteristic way of his, that rapid, comprehensive glance that catalogued everything, and Watson felt his pulse quicken, waiting for the moment when Holmes's attention would fix on the violin case, when the detective's formidable powers of observation would detect the absence hiding behind their careful arrangement of props. But Holmes's gaze moved past the case without pausing, settling instead on the fire that still burned in the grate, and he began to speak about Surrey, about the nephew, about the day's discoveries, while Watson listened with half his attention, and used the other half to manage his own relief and renewed anxiety in equal measure. Holmes hadn't noticed, or had he noticed, but chosen not to comment, or had he noticed, and was even now calculating what the empty case meant, working through the implications while appearing to discuss an entirely different matter. "The nephew is a remarkably poor liar," Holmes was saying, stretching his long legs toward the fire's warmth. "Not in the sense that his lies are implausible. They're actually quite well constructed, showing evidence of careful planning and rehearsal. But he lacks the temperament for sustained deception." When I arrived at the estate early, before our scheduled interview, I found him pacing in the garden, speaking to himself, rehearsing his story. He didn't see me, you understand, was quite absorbed in his private performance. I was able to observe him for several minutes, watching him practice expressions of grief, testing different phrasings of his explanations. It was rather like watching an actor prepare for an audition, except the role he was preparing for was devoted nephew rather than Hamlet. Extraordinary, Watson said, genuinely interested, despite his divided attention. So you confronted him with this knowledge? Not immediately, Holmes replied, accepting the glass of whiskey that Watson poured for him. The ritual of the evening drink, another small anchor of normalcy in this night that felt anything but normal to Watson's conspiracy-conscious mind. I allowed him to perform his prepared narrative first. He spoke eloquently about his devotion to his uncle, about their weekly visits, about his distress at the missing will. He had clearly memorized his script quite thoroughly. But then, I began asking questions that weren't in his script, details he hadn't prepared for, and watched him improvise. The improvisation is always where liars falter, Watson. The prepared story can be flawless, but the moment you deviate from the script, the moment you ask about something they haven't anticipated, that's when the cracks appear. Holmes took a sip of his whiskey, his eyes distant now, replaying the day's interview in his mind. I asked him about specific books from his uncle's library, you see, mentioned titles, and asked if he recalled his uncle discussing them during their supposed weekly conversations. Some of the titles I mentioned were real, books that actually existed in the library. Others I invented entirely, pure fiction, books that no one had written and no library contained. And do you know what he did, Watson? He confirmed having discussed the fictional books. Watson guessed, momentarily drawn fully into Holmes's narrative, despite his other concerns. Exactly. He nodded enthusiastically and spoke about conversations he claimed to have had about books that don't exist. It was beautifully damning. When I pointed out his error, when I explained that I'd invented several of those titles specifically to test his veracity, his entire carefully constructed story collapsed. He admitted everything, that he'd never actually visited his uncle regularly, that he'd destroyed the will because it left the estate to various charitable causes, that he'd fabricated the devoted nephew narrative to establish himself as the natural inheritor. A complete confession, then, Watson said. The case is solved. The case is solved, Holmes confirmed, but his expression suggested less satisfaction than one might expect from such a successful resolution. Though there's something rather melancholy about it, don't you think? The nephew isn't evil, precisely. He's simply weak and greedy, which is perhaps worse in its own way. Evil requires a certain strength of conviction, however misdirected. But weakness and greed are purely corrosive. They diminish without even offering the dubious dignity of genuine villainy. Watson considered this philosophical observation while simultaneously tracking Holmes's attention, which had begun to wander around the room again, in that restless way that suggested his mind was moving on from the Surrey case to other matters. The detective's gaze paused on the stack of newspapers, on the chemistry apparatus in the corner, on his correspondence file, on the violin case. Watson felt his breath catch as Holmes's attention fixed on the case by the window. The detective's expression didn't change, didn't register surprise or concern or any obvious emotion. But Watson could sense something shifting in Holmes's focus, could see the detective's eyes narrowing slightly as he observed the opened case, the bow on the chair arm, the music stand with its Beethoven sonata. Several seconds passed in silence. Holmes continued looking at the violin case, his gaze steady and unreadable, while Watson tried to maintain an expression of casual interest in their conversation, tried not to let his face betray the anxiety suddenly racing through him. This was the moment, then. This was when their conspiracy would either hold or collapse, when weeks of planning and a day of execution would prove sufficient or inadequate against Holmes' legendary observation. "Watson," Holmes said finally, his voice carrying a strange note that Watson couldn't quite identify. Amusement? Resignation? Something else entirely. "I wonder if you might help me understand something." "Of course," Watson managed, his mouth suddenly dry despite the whiskey he'd been sipping. "What is it?" Holmes gestured toward the violin case without looking away from it. "My violin appears to have vanished. The case is open, arranged as if the instrument had been recently in use, but the violin itself is absent. This is curious, wouldn't you say?" Watson's mind raced through possible explanations, possible responses. But before he could formulate anything coherent, Holmes continued, his tone still carrying that odd quality Watson couldn't quite place. "What makes it particularly curious is the specific nature of the arrangement. The bow is placed on the chair arm, you see, suggesting I'd been playing recently, and simply set it down. The music stand holds a Beethoven sonata, which I have indeed been practicing this past week. The case is open at precisely the angle I typically leave it. Everything suggests recent use, temporary displacement, the violin simply elsewhere in the flat rather than actually missing. It's all very carefully considered, very convincing, the kind of arrangement that might fool someone less observant." Holmes finally turned to look directly at Watson, and his expression was complex. Not angry, certainly, but not quite amused either. Something warmer than annoyance, something more knowing than surprise. "The problem, my dear Watson, is that I know I didn't play the violin this morning before leaving for Surrey. I was too pressed for time, too focused on reviewing my notes about the nephew. The last time I played was Tuesday evening, 2 days ago, and after playing I returned the violin to its case and closed the lid. Not fastened, of course. I never fastened the clasps, but closed. Definitely closed. Which means that someone opened the case after I had closed it. Someone removed the violin, and someone arranged these various props to suggest recent use and temporary displacement." Watson felt something plummet in his chest, felt the entire carefully constructed conspiracy crumbling like sandcastle before an incoming tide. Of course Holmes would remember. Of course Holmes would know exactly when he'd last played, would recall the precise state in which he'd left the case. They had been fools to think they could deceive him. Fools to imagine they understood his methods well enough to use them against him. "Holmes, I can explain," Watson began, but Holmes held up a hand, stopping him. "What puzzles me most," Holmes continued, as if Watson hadn't spoken, "is the timing. The violin was clearly here when I left this morning. I glanced at the case as I departed, noted its closed state, though I didn't consciously register the observation at the time, so it was removed sometime after my departure. And the only people with access to this room after I left were yourself and Mrs. Hudson." Holmes leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin in that characteristic gesture of concentration. "Now, Mrs. Hudson has never shown any particular interest in my violin. You, however, have been casting increasingly concerned glances at the instrument for the past several weeks. I've observed you noticing the worn varnish, the loose tuning peg, the mismatched strings. I've watched you wince slightly when certain notes don't quite ring true because of the instrument's poor condition. A physician's eye, you see, trained to notice deterioration, trained to see when something needs attention, even if its user has become too accustomed to the decline to notice it himself. Watson sat frozen, watching Holmes's deduction unfold with the inevitability of mathematics. Each logical step leading inexorably to the truth. So my theory, Holmes said, his tone almost gentle now, is that you, with your characteristic concern for things I neglect to care for properly, decided to have my violin repaired. You conspired with Mrs. Hudson, who would have provided the necessary access and cover, to remove the instrument while I was away in Surrey. You arranged the case and bow and music to suggest temporary displacement rather than actual absence. And the violin is now, I presume, in the hands of some craftsman who specializes in restoration, probably somewhere in Marylebone or Clerkenwell, where such craftsmen tend to cluster, undergoing whatever repairs you deemed necessary. Holmes paused, letting his deductions settle in the space between them. Am I reasonably accurate in my assessment? Watson found he couldn't speak for a moment, caught between chagrin at being so completely seen through and a strange sort of admiration for the elegance with which Holmes had dismantled their entire conspiracy. Finally, he managed. Completely accurate. Holmes, I apologize for the deception. I know you dislike surprises, dislike having things done behind your back. But the violin needed attention, proper attention, and I knew you would never see to it yourself, would continue playing it until it fell apart entirely. So I found a craftsman, Mr. Abernathy in Marylebone, who specializes in violin restoration. Mrs. Hudson helped me remove it this morning while you were departing. It should be ready in 4 or 5 days, properly restored, playing as it should. Silence filled the sitting room, broken only by the fire's crackle and the distant sounds of London's nighttime existence beyond the windows. Watson waited for Holmes's response, uncertain what form it would take. Annoyance at the presumption? Irritation at the deception? Or perhaps that cold withdrawal that Holmes sometimes employed when displeased. But when Holmes spoke, his voice carried neither anger nor coldness. "You took my violin," he said slowly, "which you noticed was in poor condition. You researched craftsmen who could restore it properly. You enlisted Mrs. Hudson's help. You arranged the removal with careful attention to timing and detail. You created a cover story using your knowledge of my habits and patterns. All of this to help me to care for something I use daily but have failed to maintain. All of this knowing I would likely deduce the deception and that I might react poorly to the discovery." Holmes paused, and when he continued, something in his voice had shifted, had become softer somehow, more tentative. That's quite remarkably kind, Watson. Foolish, perhaps, given my temperament and my general response to surprises. But kind, decidedly kind. Watson felt warmth flooding through him, relief, and something more complicated, something that had to do with friendship and its particular vocabulary of gestures and responses. "I simply wanted to help," he said quietly. "The instrument means a great deal to you. It deserved proper care." "It did," Holmes agreed, "though I confess I hadn't noticed quite how much it had deteriorated. One becomes accustomed to gradual decline, you see. The violin played slightly worse each day, but each day's decline was so small as to be imperceptible. Only over weeks and months does the accumulation become significant. A useful metaphor for many things, I suppose. He stood and moved to the window, looking down at the empty violin case with an expression Watson couldn't quite read. "How long did you say the restoration would require?" 4 or 5 days, Mr. Abernathy estimated. He wanted to do it properly, new varnish where needed, matched strings, repair to the tuning peg, adjustment of the bridge and sound post. He said the instrument had good bones, that it would sing beautifully once properly restored. "Good bones," Holmes repeated, seeming pleased by the phrase. "Yes, I've always thought so, though I lacked the expertise to restore them properly myself. You've done well, Watson, both in recognizing the need and in executing the plan. Though I must say, your conspiracy had one significant flaw." "What flaw?" Watson asked, curious despite himself. Holmes turned from the window, and his expression held genuine amusement now. "You should have removed the bow as well. If I'd truly been playing before I left this morning, I would have placed the bow in the case with the violin, not left it lying on the chair arm. The bow-on-chair arm arrangement suggests recent playing with the intent to play again shortly. But I had no such intent this morning. That small inconsistency is what first alerted me that something was amiss, though the evidence accumulated quickly thereafter." Watson shook his head, half rueful, half admiring. "Of course. I should have known we couldn't deceive you completely." "You deceived me quite effectively for most of the day," Holmes countered. "I had no suspicion whatever until I returned this evening and saw the arrangement. That's rather impressive, Watson. Most people couldn't fool me for 10 minutes, much less 10 hours. They stood together in the warm lamplight of the sitting room, the fire burning low now, the evening settling into that peculiar quietness that preceded true night. Outside, Baker Street had grown still, the day's business concluded, only the occasional late cab or solitary pedestrian disturbing the darkness. "So," Watson ventured, "you're not angry about the deception?" Holmes considered this question with apparent seriousness. "I should be, shouldn't I? I generally detest having things done behind my back, detest being managed or manipulated, even benevolently. But no, Watson, I'm not angry. Surprised, certainly. Touched, actually, though that's not a word I use comfortably. Grateful, definitely. The violin did need attention, and I would never have attended to it myself. So while your methods were deceptive, your intentions were sound, and the outcome will presumably be beneficial. Under the circumstances, anger seems churlish." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "Though I would appreciate it if future benevolent conspiracies could be conducted with slightly less dramatic staging. The Beethoven sonata on the music stand was perhaps a touch too theatrical." Watson laughed, relief flooding through him, the tension that had accumulated over the day finally releasing. "Noted, future conspiracies will be more understated." "See that they are," Holmes said, returning to his chair and his whiskey. "Now, shall we discuss something other than my violins and your admittedly well-intentioned deceptions? I'm quite tired of Surrey and nephews and missing wills. Tell me about your fictional patient with the suspicious angina. I'd be curious to know if my diagnosis holds up under closer examination." And so they talked, slipping back into their usual patterns of conversation, the violin's absence acknowledged but no longer urgent, the conspiracy revealed but forgiven, the friendship between them perhaps slightly strengthened by the day's small drama of care and deception and discovery. The fire burned down to embers, the night deepened beyond the windows, and 221B Baker Street settled into its familiar rhythms, a place where mysteries were solved and friendships were maintained, where sometimes the greatest detective in London allowed himself to be deceived by those who cared for him, and where that deception, properly motivated, could become its own form of truth. The days that followed Holmes's return from Surrey possessed a curious quality, an atmosphere of gentle anticipation that coloured even the most ordinary moments. Watson found himself moving through his routines with heightened awareness, conscious always of the violin's absence and its promised return, aware that a small drama they had set in motion was approaching its resolution. Holmes, for his part, seemed to have settled into acceptance of the situation with surprising ease, occasionally making wry comments about the empty case by the window, but showing no signs of actual distress at the instrument's temporary disappearance. "It's rather like having a limb in a cast," Holmes observed on Saturday morning, glancing at the case while passing it on his way to consult a reference book. "One knows it's being attended to, knows it will eventually be returned improved, but one still feels the absence, rather acutely. I found myself reaching for it 3 times since Thursday, intending to work through a problem with music rather than words, only to remember that my usual method of thinking has been temporarily confiscated for its own good." Watson looked up from his breakfast, noting the good humour in Holmes's tone despite the complaint. Confiscated is rather a strong word. Borrowed for repair, perhaps. "Borrowed implies permission was requested," Holmes countered, but his eyes held amusement rather than reproach. "This was more of a benevolent theft, which I'm discovering is a peculiar hybrid. One is simultaneously the victim and the beneficiary, which creates a confused emotional response. I'm not certain whether to feel grateful or aggrieved, so I've settled on feeling both simultaneously, which is exhausting, but comprehensive." Mrs. Hudson, entering with fresh tea, allowed herself a small smile at this exchange. She and Watson had discussed Holmes's reaction several times since Thursday evening, both of them relieved and somewhat surprised by the detective's graceful acceptance of their conspiracy. "Mr. Abernathy sent word yesterday," she informed them, setting the tea tray on the table with her usual precision. "He says the work is progressing beautifully and expects to complete it by Monday afternoon. He's been quite thorough, apparently. The violin has received more attention in these few days than it's probably had in years." "Decades, more likely," Holmes said. "I acquired the instrument in 1887, and I confess I've done little more than replace broken strings since then. I'm curious to hear how it sounds when properly maintained. The sound I'm accustomed to may be merely a degraded version of what the instrument can actually produce." The weekend passed in a state of pleasant suspension, time marked by the usual activities of 221B Baker Street, but coloured by anticipation of Monday's retrieval. Holmes occupied himself with correspondence and with organising his notes on several recent cases, preparing them for Watson's eventual publication, though he grumbled about Watson's tendency to emphasise drama over deduction, romance over reason. Watson attended to his own work, seeing patients at his practice on Saturday morning, writing in the afternoon, reading in the evening, while Holmes played chess against himself by the fire, moving pieces according to some internal logic that resulted in both sides playing brilliantly and neither achieving victory. Sunday brought the kind of grey, quiet day that London Sundays often possessed in winter. A day when the city seemed to exhale and slow, when even the traffic on Baker Street diminished to occasional passage rather than constant flow. Watson attended morning service at a nearby church, a habit he maintained partly from genuine faith, and partly from the comforting structure of ritual. Holmes remained at the flat, claiming that organized religion held no interest for a mind that preferred evidence to faith, though Watson suspected the detective simply enjoyed having the sitting room entirely to himself for a few hours, a rare solitude in their generally shared existence. When Watson returned, he found Holmes at the window, looking down at Baker Street with that particular quality of attention that suggested he was observing something specific, rather than simply watching the general flow of life. "Something interesting?" Watson asked, joining him at the window and following his gaze. "The tobacconist across the street," Holmes said, gesturing slightly with his pipe. "He's received a delivery of some kind, but look at how the delivery man handles the package, with excessive care, as if it contains something fragile or valuable. Yet, it's not the usual size or shape for tobacco shipments. And see how the tobacconist immediately takes it through to the back room rather than unpacking it in the shop. There's something irregular about it, something that wants privacy." Watson looked but saw only an ordinary transaction between a shopkeeper and a delivery man. Perhaps it's personal, rather than business-related? A gift of some kind? Perhaps, Holmes agreed, but his tone suggested he was unconvinced. Or perhaps our tobacconist is diversifying his inventory in ways that might not bear close examination. I've noticed several such unusual deliveries over the past month, always handled with the same excessive discretion. It bears watching, I think. They stood together at the window, this odd pairing of doctor and detective, watching the street below with its Sunday rhythms, its patterns of movement and stillness that had characterized Baker Street for decades, and would characterize it for decades more. Watson found himself thinking about the nature of observation, about how Holmes saw the world in layers of meaning that remained invisible to ordinary perception, how every transaction held potential significance, every detail might prove crucial. It was an exhausting way to experience existence, Watson reflected, though Holmes seemed energized, rather than depleted by his constant analysis of everything around him. "Do you ever wish," Watson ventured, "that you could simply look at something without immediately analyzing it? That you could see a delivery man and a tobacconist without wondering about irregular shipments and hidden motives?" Holmes considered this question with apparent seriousness. "Occasionally," he admitted. "There are moments when I envy ordinary perception, when I think it might be restful to observe without deducing, to see without interpreting. But then something interesting presents itself, some small mystery or anomaly, and I realize that for me the analysis is the interest. Without it, the world would seem terribly flat, terribly dull. I observe and deduce, not because I must, but because I cannot imagine being satisfied with anything less." Monday arrived grey and damp, typical January weather that made indoor fires and hot tea seem less like luxuries than necessities. Watson woke early, awareness of the day's significance already present before full consciousness had settled. Today the violin would return. Today Mr. Abernathy's work would be complete. Today they would discover whether the restoration had achieved what Watson had hoped for. The instrument restored not just to functionality, but to its full potential. Its voice renewed, Its capacity for music expanded beyond what Holmes had grown accustomed to. Mrs. Hudson appeared at mid-morning with news that Mr. Abernathy had sent word the violin was ready for collection. She had volunteered to retrieve it herself, but Watson insisted on accompanying her, wanting to see the restored instrument, wanting to speak with Mr. Abernathy about what he had discovered and repaired. Holmes, absorbed in his morning papers, waved them off with distracted permission, though Watson suspected the detective's attention was less focused on the newspapers than it might appear, that some part of Holmes's formidable mind was tracking their departure and anticipating the violin's return. The cab ride to Marylebone carried them through London's Monday morning bustle, the city fully engaged with the week's business after Sunday's brief respite. Watson watched the streets pass with that pleasant detachment that cab rides encouraged, the sense of moving through the city without being quite part of it, observing life through glass while remaining separate from its immediate demands. Mr. Abernathy's workshop occupied the ground floor of a narrow building tucked down a side street, where workshops and small manufactories clustered together in the way that related businesses tend to accumulate. The sign above the door proclaimed Abernathy and Sons, Fine Instrument Repair, though Watson gathered from Mrs. Hudson that the Sons were more aspiration than current reality, the children having pursued other professions despite their father's craft. The interior of the workshop was exactly as Mrs. Hudson had described, a small space made smaller by the instruments that filled it, violins and violas and cellos in various states of repair, hanging from hooks on the walls or resting on benches, their wooden bodies glowing in the light from the large windows that dominated one wall. The air carried the scent of wood and varnish and something else, something resinous and faintly sweet that Watson couldn't identify, but found pleasant. It was a craftsman's space, organized according to the logic of someone who knew exactly where everything needed to be, even if that organization would appear chaotic to outside perception. Mr. Abernathy himself was a small, neat man in his 60s, with the kind of careful hands that spoke of decades working with delicate objects, and eyes that held the focused intensity of someone who saw details that others missed. In this, Watson thought, he was not unlike Holmes, though his field of expertise was wood and sound, rather than crime and deduction. "Dr. Watson," Abernathy said, his voice carrying a slight Scottish burr that suggested origins north of the border, though softened by years in London. "And Mrs. Hudson, returned to collect your gentleman's violin. I've been eager to show you what we've accomplished. Come, see for yourself." He led them to a bench near the windows, where Holmes's violin rested in its case, but Watson almost didn't recognize it. The transformation was remarkable. Where before the instrument had been worn and tired-looking, the varnish faded and scratched. Now it gleamed with renewed beauty. The finish had been carefully restored, the wood's natural grain visible beneath the clear varnish, the colour rich and warm in the morning light. New strings gleamed silver against the dark wood, perfectly matched, perfectly positioned. The tuning pegs sat flush and firm, no longer loose or uncertain. "It's beautiful," Watson said, genuinely awed by the transformation. "Mr. Abernathy, you've done extraordinary work." The craftsman's face showed quiet satisfaction at this praise, the pleasure of someone who takes pride in work well done. "The instrument had good bones, as I told Mrs. Hudson when she first brought it to me. Beneath the wear and neglect, it was fundamentally sound, well made, deserving of proper care. I stripped the old varnish where it had worn away and reapplied it, with a formula I learned in Italy, matching the original as closely as possible. I replaced all the strings with a proper matched set, silk core wrapped with silver wire, the finest quality available. The loose tuning peg required careful work to restore proper tension without damaging the wood, and the bridge needed adjustment, along with the sound post, to optimize the instrument's resonance. He lifted the violin from its case with the reverent care of someone handling something precious, and drew the bow across the strings in a brief, experimental passage. The sound that emerged made Watson catch his breath, pure, clear, resonant, nothing like the slightly muted, slightly discordant voice he'd grown accustomed to hearing from Holmes's playing. This was what the instrument had been meant to sound like, what it could achieve when properly maintained and cared for. "Play it for Mr. Holmes yourself when you return it," Abernathy suggested, returning the violin carefully to its case. "Let him hear what it sounds like before he picks it up. Sometimes the transformation is so complete that one needs to hear it from outside before playing it oneself to fully appreciate the change." Watson agreed, and after settling the bill, the cost was substantial, but felt entirely justified by the work completed. They departed with the violin carefully secured, returning through London's grey afternoon toward Baker Street, and the sitting room where Holmes waited, aware of their errand, but unaware of quite how dramatic the transformation had been. The return to 221B felt almost ceremonial. Watson carrying the violin case with careful attention, Mrs. Hudson preceding him up the stairs to announce their arrival. Holmes was at his desk when they entered, but he turned immediately at the sound of the door, his attention fixing on the case Watson carried with an intensity that suggested carefully suppressed anticipation. "The prodigal violin returns," Holmes said, his tone light, but his eyes sharp with interest. "Successfully restored, I presume, given your expressions of satisfaction?" "More than restored," Watson said, moving to the window where the case had sat empty for days. He set it down, opened it to reveal the gleaming instrument within, and heard Holmes's sharp intake of breath at the sight. "Good Lord," Holmes said quietly, standing and moving closer to examine the violin. "Watson, this is... I barely recognize it. It looks nearly new." "It's been properly cared for," Watson said. "Mr. Abernathy is a master craftsman, but the real transformation is in the sound. He suggested I should play it for you first, let you hear it before you hold it yourself. May I?" Holmes nodded, seeming momentarily at a loss for words, and Watson lifted the violin from its case with hands that trembled slightly from nervousness rather than inexperience. He had played violin himself years ago, though never with Holmes's skill or dedication, and his fingers found the positions with the hesitancy of remembered knowledge, not recently practiced. He drew the bow across the strings, producing a simple scale, nothing complex or demanding, just enough to demonstrate the instrument's voice. The sound filled the sitting room like light, pure and clear and resonant, each note distinct, yet flowing into the next with perfect continuity. It was the voice the violin had always possessed potentially, but had been prevented from achieving by wear and neglect. And hearing it now, Watson understood why musicians spoke of their instruments as if they were living things, as if they possessed souls that could be nurtured or damaged, encouraged or suppressed. He played a few more notes, and then stopped, returning the violin carefully to Holmes's waiting hands. The detective took it, with something approaching reverence, holding it as if seeing it for the first time, his long fingers finding their familiar positions on the fingerboard, his other hand raising the bow with the unconscious grace of years of practice. And then Holmes played. He started with something simple, a back melody that Watson recognized, letting his fingers relearn the instrument's new responsiveness, adjusting to strings that held their tune perfectly, to a bow that drew sound with less effort than before. The music flowed from Holmes's hands with increasing confidence, and Watson could see the moment when the detective truly understood what had been done, when he recognized that this was not just repair, but restoration, not just fixing what was broken, but revealing what had always been possible. Holmes transitioned from Bach to something original, an improvisation that seemed to be testing the violin's capabilities, exploring its range and resonance. The notes climbed and fell, sometimes tender, sometimes triumphant, always clear and true. The loose tuning peg no longer required mid-performance adjustment. The mismatched strings no longer created subtle dissonances. The worn varnish no longer dampened the wood's natural resonance. Every limitation that Holmes had unconsciously accommodated over years of playing had been removed, and the music that resulted was transformed. When Holmes finally lowered the violin, his expression held something Watson had rarely seen: genuine emotion, clearly visible, unguarded. "Watson," he said quietly, I don't have adequate words. The instrument plays as I've always imagined it should, but never quite achieved. Every note is clear, every phrase resonates properly. It's as if I've been speaking with a slight stutter for years, and suddenly discovered fluency." "I'm glad," Watson said simply, moved by Holmes's reaction in ways he couldn't quite articulate. "The violin deserved proper care, and you deserve an instrument that serves your abilities rather than limiting them." Holmes set the violin carefully in its case, but his hand lingered on its surface, fingertips tracing the restored varnish with something like wonder. "You did this," he said, looking at Watson with an expression that held gratitude and something more complicated, something that had to do with friendship and its particular vocabulary of care. "You noticed what needed doing, found someone capable of doing it, arranged the entire conspiracy simply because you thought I would benefit from it. Watson, that's friendship of a quality I'm not certain I've earned or deserve." "Nonsense," Watson said, uncomfortable with such direct emotion, but moved by it nonetheless. "You would do the same for me, in your own way. We care for each other, Holmes. That's what friends do. They notice what needs attention, and they attend to it, whether asked or not." Mrs. Hudson, who had remained quietly present throughout this exchange, chose this moment to speak. "I'll bring tea," she said simply, "and perhaps something a bit stronger than tea, given the occasion. This seems like a moment that deserves proper marking." She departed, leaving Watson and Holmes in the sitting room with the restored violin and the late afternoon light that filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the familiar disorder of their shared space. Holmes stood, looking at the instrument in its case, and Watson could see him processing not just the violin's transformation, but everything it represented: the observation, the planning, the care, the gesture of friendship that had required deception to accomplish. "You know," Holmes said eventually, his tone returning to something more like his usual analytical detachment, "this entire Experience has taught me something about observation that I hadn't fully appreciated before. I spend my life noticing details others miss, seeing patterns in apparent chaos, deducing truths from small evidences. But I failed to notice that my own violin needed attention, failed to observe its gradual decline because I was too close to it, too accustomed to its limitations. It required your outside perspective, your physician's eye trained to spot deterioration, to see what I couldn't see about something I use daily. He paused, then added with a slight smile. It's humbling, actually. The great detective, blind to what was directly before him, requiring rescue by his more observant friend. There's a lesson in that about the limitations of even the most trained perception. The lesson, Watson suggested, might be that we all have blind spots, and we're fortunate when we have friends willing to see what we cannot. Indeed, Holmes agreed, though I maintain that your conspiracy, however successful, relied on more luck than sound planning. If I had decided to play the violin Thursday morning before leaving for Surrey, your entire scheme would have collapsed immediately. But you didn't decide to play, Watson pointed out, because we timed the removal for a day when we knew you'd be preoccupied with travel and interviews. That's not luck, Holmes. That's planning. Holmes conceded this point with a graceful nod. Fair enough. Your conspiracy was both well-planned and successfully executed. I hereby acknowledge you and Mrs. Hudson as competent conspirators, though I trust you won't use these skills against me again without very good reason. Mrs. Hudson returned with tea and whiskey both, setting the tray between them with the satisfied expression of someone who had participated in a successful venture and now witnessed its happy conclusion. They sat together in the comfortable arrangement of chairs and sofa that had become second nature over years of shared residence, drinking their tea and whiskey as the afternoon faded toward evening, as the lamplighters began their rounds on Baker Street below, as London transitioned from day to night with its usual patient inevitability. Holmes played the violin again later that evening, a longer performance this time, working through pieces he knew well, and seemed to be rediscovering through the instrument's restored voice. Watson listened with his eyes closed, letting the music wash over him, feeling the satisfaction that came from a gesture well executed, from care properly offered and gratefully received, from friendship expressed in the vocabulary of action rather than words. The music filled 221B Baker Street with sound that seemed to acknowledge everything the space had witnessed, the mysteries solved and unsolved, the dangers faced and overcome, the long conversations by firelight, the comfortable silences, the partnership between two men who had found in each other something neither had quite expected, but both had come to depend upon. The violin sang of all this and more, its restored voice a testament to care and craft, and the small transformations that attention could achieve. When Holmes finally finished playing and returned the violin to its case, the evening had settled fully into night, and Baker Street outside had grown quiet, save for the occasional late cab rattling past. The fire burned low in the grate, casting shadows that danced across the walls, and the three of them, detective, doctor, and housekeeper, sat together in the warm lamplight, united by their conspiracy and its successful resolution, by the small drama of care they had enacted together. "Thank you," Holmes said finally, the words simple but weighted with genuine feeling. "Both of you, for noticing, for caring, for going to considerable trouble on my behalf. The violin plays beautifully, and I suspect I'll think of this kindness every time I lift it from its case, which means you've managed to attach sentiment to an object I had previously considered purely practical. That's either a gift or a curse. I haven't yet decided which. A gift, Watson said firmly. Definitely a gift. We'll see, Holmes replied, but his smile suggested he agreed. The night deepened around them, and 221B Baker Street settled into its familiar rhythms, a place where mysteries were solved and friendships were maintained, where sometimes the greatest detective in London allowed himself to be surprised by kindness, where a conspiracy of care had restored not just a violin, but had reminded all of them that attention and affection, properly expressed, could transform even the most ordinary objects into something that resonated with meaning far beyond their physical presence. The violin rested in its case, restored and waiting, ready to translate thought into sound, to give voice to the things that could not be spoken but could be played, to sing through the long London nights with a clarity it had not possessed for years, but would possess now for years to come, thanks to friendship and conspiracy, and the simple truth that some things, when properly cared for, could be restored not just to what they were, but to what they had always been meant to be. And in that restoration, in that small gesture of care disguised as deception, Watson had offered Holmes something the detective rarely received, but deeply needed. Evidence that he was seen, that he was valued, that someone paid attention to his needs even when he himself neglected them, that friendship could sometimes mean doing what someone required rather than what they requested, that care took many forms but was always recognizable to those willing to see it. The fire dimmed to embers, the tea grew cold, and the three conspirators sat together in comfortable silence, bound by what they had done and what it meant, by the music that had filled the room and the friendship that had made the music possible. Outside, London breathed, its nighttime breath, the city never truly sleeping, but merely shifting into its nocturnal mode, and somewhere in that vast darkness, other mysteries waited to be solved, other cases waited to be taken up. But here, in this moment, in this sitting room, where so much had already occurred, and so much more would occur, there was only peace and satisfaction, and the quiet knowledge that sometimes the smallest gestures carried the greatest weight, that friendship expressed through action rather than words could achieve transformations that surprised even those who initiated them. The violin had come home, restored and renewed, and in its restoration had reminded all of them that care and attention could heal what time and neglect had damaged, that friendship properly practiced could transform not just objects, but relationships, that sometimes the best surprises were the ones that revealed to people how much they were valued, how carefully they were observed, how deeply they were appreciated by those who knew them best. And so the case of the vanishing violin concluded, not with drama or danger or the solving of a grand mystery, but with music and gratitude and the quiet satisfaction of friends who had conspired together toward kindness, who had succeeded in their deception precisely because it was motivated by care, and who would remember this small adventure not for its complexity, but for its gentle reminder that friendship, at its best, meant paying attention to what needed attention and providing what was needed, even when, especially when, doing so required a touch of benevolent conspiracy. The night pressed against the windows, the embers glowed in the grate, and 221B Baker Street dreamed its Victorian dreams, a place where the extraordinary and the ordinary mingled freely, where the world's greatest detective lived alongside his loyal friend, where music could be restored, and friendships could be strengthened, and small acts of care could echo far beyond their immediate execution, reminding everyone involved that sometimes the simplest gestures carried the deepest meanings, that kindness required no justification beyond itself, and that friendship, properly understood and practiced, was its own reward, its own mystery, its own perfectly resolved case.